Yes, yes, we are here. We are here. And so we will jump right in, so to speak. As this vehicle was directed to connect in with the conscious awareness of the one called Enoch. And you could say that this individual has merged back into a more expanded, higher dimensional aspect of self beyond just the human expression. And this is significant as the individual will be speaking from many reference points, both of his human life as Enoch and beyond. Thank you. And I am here to express today many things, as this individual has been directed to seek connection with many of the common figures that are spoken about in your current day, both religiously, historically, and other, for the purpose of giving greater perspectives upon not only the reality that you are all finding yourselves in, but beyond. And so, while you could say that much of the expressions that have been written and put forward about me have been expanded upon and altered in the passage of links of experience and from person to person in the telling. And then, of course, in the individual's interpretation in the writing. And so, while my name was not truly Enoch, this is a satisfactory label that I will, you could say, step into for the purpose of this expression. As I did walk on the earth in a time when many things were shifting and changing and coming to light. And so, while you may have heard of an expression given almost as if it is a title, Enoch and the Watchers, I would like to speak upon this, as it is very convoluted and distorted through its interpretation lenses of religion and the culture at the time of its recording. As truly, you could say that at this time, not only were men looking for a justification for the urges and the actions that they found themselves and others around them committing, but also for, you could say, a redemption in the form of a higher way of thinking, a more expanded way of thinking. And of course, this was introduced. And so, if I were to express my view of the Watchers, This is simply an expression of an awareness of a more expanded form of intelligence and being. As for myself, I was given great dreams and recognitions of this in many different ways and forms. And even I will admit that some of my own conditioning from my culture and their belief systems did color the messages I was receiving. However, I did recognize quite quickly that when it seemed as if there were discrepancies in what I was seeing in the world around me and the messages and promptings I was getting, I realized that the discrepancy lay with the human view and perspective, and not with that of the messengers, of the watchers. And so essentially, I began speaking and ministering to those around me. The best I could, I did attempt to share the messages I was getting in ways that would give another perspective without being too challenging to the belief systems that were held at the time. And from this perspective of me, a more expanded awareness beyond just the human form, I am wanting to say that this was at a time when there was many introductions of, I will say, various forms of beings, and also I am searching for the appropriate word, as the word substance did seem most appropriate at first, but it would be what this vehicle would refer to as organisms. It could also be labeled as fungi. And so many different materials were being introduced into the Earth experience, and this was not the first time, as essentially there was a jump in the expression of the human being, as they did express quite differently for many, many cycles on this planet. And then through the interaction with other beings, there was alterations made to the expression of that being that did become this human form that you are familiar with today. And so, along with the introductions of these, what you would call DNA or biological addition to that form, there was the introduction of that substance, that organism. And so it did essentially perpetuate itself and spread across this planet, this third dimensional experience. And with this organism did come an interaction with the human biological form. It did cause, in a sense, alterations to the instincts and the way that the mind did process reality. And so this is when many changes began to happen in the society of the beings operating and interacting here on Earth. Not just the humanoids, but also the plant life and the animal life as well. This shift in how this reality expressed itself was vast. And for those newly altered humans, the shift began taking place of, as opposed to seeing themselves as natural participants in the environment and the ecosystem, they began to see themselves as separate. They began to see themselves as more. And, well, this is true. You are all so much more than just a factor on a planet in an ecosystem. And yet, so are all expressions of life. All expressions of life are conscious awareness integrated into an experience here in the third dimension, what you would call souls, having third dimensional experiences. And yet, the separation they began seeing from nature and from each other was one that was skewed. It was not a true sense of self. It was an alteration to the identity, the awareness of the being. And so this is also where the idea of, you could say, searching for something to make sense of it all, something to guide and direct. And this came about because of that disconnect from the natural environment and from the natural guidance from us, the higher dimensional beings. And so it became a seeking this through the physical expression, as opposed to having this in a knowing and deeply integrated with the sense of being. And of course, the higher dimensional beings are always connected with their 3D counterparts, their soul fractals. And yet there was a disconnection in the conscious awareness of this connection. And so mankind began seeking understanding and guidance from the heavenly bodies, the sun, the moon, the stars and planets, from the forces of nature, from other human beings who did elevate themselves above the rest. And while this was not the intention for this experience when it was designed and put into creation, it was allowed to unfold, to be utilized for a greater purpose of evolution and resolution and completion. However, that is getting a bit off on the expression I am wanting to have with you all today. However, that was a necessary piece of backstory for these expressions that will be laid forth in this work. And so now going back to myself and the human period I was expressing my being into. At this point in the experience, mankind was seeking out deities as many different experiences had been had and given of contact with other forms of beings, of contact with certain forms of what were called spirits, as I was truly not the only one who was getting these impressions and messages from higher dimensional beings. And yet much was lost in the translation of these messages, as they were learning to effectively communicate and express themselves and their views and their support through the alterations and the conditionings of the organisms that were introduced. And so mankind began to see that an expanded conscious awareness to them was interpreted as a form of ruler or God. And well, these terms were not immediately placed upon these beings and the higher dimensional beings. The concept was the same. They were deified. As mankind was so deeply integrated with and caught up in the physical senses, rather than seeing the body and the physical senses as means to experience this reality, they were seeing them as their true sense of being and self. And so when other beings, when other expressions would be given, this was seen as something above them, greater than them, more than them. And so, even with the continuous fine tuning of these expressions and connections with greater conscious awareness, mankind did take these things and run with them. They did subject themselves to them and they did bow down to them. And so, of course, I was trying to expand and elevate my people. And yet, though I was trying to expand the minds, the awareness of my people, many things by this time had been put into place that were barriers to this. And so, before moving forward, I will just revert in order to clarify a few of my earlier expressions about mankind's contact with other beings. For example, there was the integration of the alteration to the DNA of what was before the human species. And so in this alteration, there was certain markers given by these beings. And while your human history has its vague references to Anunnaki and many other contacts by beings from off planet, it is much different from the expressions that you have in your histories. There have been many more things that have unfolded on this planet than most human beings are aware of. And so, essentially, there was I will say, infiltration. And I will expand upon this as essentially the infiltration was contact with a species of being. This species of being was very technologically advanced. And you could say that the origin point of this species of being was on what you call your planet Mars. And to give it a human frame of reference, this is the species that you would refer to today as the reptilians or the draconians. And I should say and rather than or, as both of these species were participating on this planet. And while the expression of the humanoids and the reptilian-based life forms does expand out far beyond just the Earth solar system experience, for now we are just referencing this, your localized experience bubble of reality. And essentially, this species was developed and evolved on what you would call the planet Mars. They became very disconnected as well, as essentially this was an experimental planetary experience. It was designed to give these species a resolution for other expressions in other experiential bubbles. And yet the themes of hierarchy, rulership, control, and the harvesting of resources from the planet was deeply ingrained into the conscious awareness of these beings. And so they did essentially en masse on the planet harvest instead of recognizing that the planet itself was its own form of being. had its own conscious awareness. They saw themselves as the rulers of this. A comparison to this would be the way that a virus does affect the human body, as essentially it does take over and harvest the natural systems of the being in order for its own perpetuation and flourishing. And unlike a parasite, it does essentially consume the host being. And so this is exactly what was unfolding on this planet. And yet, through their great technological advances, when they did recognize that their planetary experience was about to have a massive shift that would essentially be the exit point for the conscious awareness of the planet and the exit point for many of those beings that did inhabit it, they did begin to take measures to perpetuate themselves into other experiences. And so there is much more that could be expressed upon this and the intricacies of these experiences and why they did unfold. And yet this will be explained in further conversations. For now, I am wanting to refocus. And so these beings did introduce themselves into the Earth experience and bringing with them not only organisms from their home planet, but also their own conditioning of suppression and hierarchy, control and harvesting. And it could be said that the organisms that were brought were biologically encoded to perpetuate these same effects as the conditioning of these beings, as essentially they were introduced to the home population of these reptilian and draconian beings in order to further accentuate the control and suppression. What you could say is the worship of the leaders and the ruler. And so the introduction of this here did cause quite a shift. And so as these beings did integrate themselves into this planetary experience, there was a quick recognition that the difference in appearance of these beings and the native beings here on the Earth planet did cause quite a stir. And so there was a shift that did take place here. These beings did essentially invent a way to cloak themselves in illusion, appearing to be very similar to the human form, and yet different in the sense of being larger with a wide range of variety of abilities. And many of these were fostered by technology. And so as they had made the alterations to the human DNA, it was encoded in this that they would see these beings as a form of deity, that they would allow themselves to be suppressed and controlled and ruled over. And so, in many senses, there was a great compliance to this. And yet, as I have shared, there was still the connections with the higher dimensional beings. And these higher dimensional beings, still guiding and supporting this experience, did essentially introduce many individuals like myself. And one of the earlier interactions that I had was exactly what I am explaining to you now. The understanding of what had been unfolding for humanity, the integration and infiltration of another species into the experience, and the alteration of the beingness of mankind. And so you could say that this was a mental antidote to the changes that were made to the inherent structure of the current human expression, as essentially this knowledge did integrate itself into the mental structure, the conscious awareness, and did allow for a alteration to the DNA expression. And of course, I was not given it in these specific terms, as I had no reference point for any of these things in my day, and yet the common understanding of humans today allows for a much clearer expression of these things. And this is why many of you make connections to your current scientific understanding of your biological expressions into the cultures and societies of history. As I said, many were given a form of understanding of this in order to allow for a divergence in what could be said was a hostile takeover of humanity. And so the majority was subject to societal structures that were quickly being developed and put into place. Structures of power and control, separation, war, and yes, even currency was something that was later introduced by these beings, as they did essentially encode a lust for certain earth elements. And of course, I do understand that this is a very complex and vast expression that I am giving, and yet, for those who are ready to receive it and understand it, this is significant. And so I did recognize quite quickly that the understandings I had been given were only a part of what I was being led to express to my people. And so I did spend much time communing with the higher dimensional beings. And you could say for quite some time, even I did see them as a form of deity, as they were so much more expanded and advanced than my human mind could comprehend. And yet they did encourage me to commune with them often. And in this communing, what they did begin to lay out for me was, in a sense, a framework for what you would call now as evolution. And yet it was not a physical evolution that they were guiding us towards. It was one of the mind and the true being, the conscious awareness or the soul. And while I did not understand the full significance of this at the time, I did recognize that it was vastly significant. It was a very important calling and mission that I was given. And in scanning now to express a greater frame of reference for others who were led through this same process, there were several different groups of individuals across your planet that were given these same understandings and led on the path of a conscious awareness evolution. And the significance of this that I see now is, in a sense, to encode a blueprint into humanity for this idea of evolution of the conscious awareness to essentially encode itself into the human experience in order to perpetuate and grow into what you now call today as the Grand Awakening. As essentially there has been a conflict of the programming of the conscious mind, one that has been very dedicated to keeping the human mind suppressed, limited, and controlled, and one that has been encoding and offering expansion, enlightenment, as you might say. And there have been great shifts in the majority of which programming did perpetuate itself in greater degrees. And so more about this will be expressed throughout this work. But for my specific expression of my journey with my people, I did quite often seek guidance as to how to express these things and essentially offer the programming antidote into my people. And so they did give me quite the vast range of concepts and ideas to bring forward. Many of these were lost in translation, as I was speaking to my people of the mind, the true sense of being as an eternal soul. And while I will not get into the complexities of the creation of the different aspects of the soul and of the original conscious awareness or soul, the mind of all, as they did express it to me in several different ways. And yet just know that the soul, the conscious awareness, is not born with the body, nor does it die with the body. And this was a foundational concept that I gave to my people in order to begin bringing the understanding that they are so much more than just this very fragile, very limited expression known today as human beings. I did begin to give them the concepts that they were mind, separate from the human body and yet operating through the human body. That the urges and the desires of the human body were not always those urges given by the greater sense of true awareness. I did begin laying out for them the discrepancy, the divergence of separation from oneness and unity with each other and with the environment. We did begin making great alterations in the way that we expressed our society. And the changes that were seen from this were profound. They began to recognize very quickly that the information I was bringing forward to them was something to be heeded. And so, as we also had to be very careful, almost hidden, you could say, in our life experiences, as the way that we were beginning to live was so vastly different from that of the people groups around us. We were constantly moving, constantly seeking safety. And this did bring great hardship. And also at the same time, I was having to undo the threads of programming that caused the people in my group to want to elevate me to a status of greatness or deification. And this was so against everything I was teaching, everything I was sharing with them, that this did cause great hardship for me as well, as I was having to be very diligent in my expressions of these connections and my expressions of myself, as I had to very firmly offer the concept many times of equality, that souls are all equal, regardless of the expansiveness or limitedness of the awareness, the inherent value of the soul is just as great for each and every expression as it is for the mind of all, the original awareness, as all beings are simply an individualized expression of this mind of all, original awareness. And this was a very difficult concept for many, as they were so ingrained with the ideas of structure and hierarchy, separation. And so the concept of oneness and unity was a very difficult one for them to accept. And yet I was diligent and focused in my expression of being and what I see now as my role in living that lifetime as the one you call Enoch. And so, with full love and awareness and compassion of my mission, I did guide, I did collaborate, I did organize my society through our study, our conversation, and eventually our unified connection with higher dimensional beings. they did begin to expand greatly, as did I. And so eventually the awareness was given that there would be a transition, a movement out of this life expression into another. They expressed this as a great gift being given. They expressed this as another path on the journey of life expression. And so we did even more diligently guide and direct our focus to achieving this. And with the great assistance and guidance of the higher dimensional beings, we were able to. And so this is where the expression does come from that Enoch was taken up to heaven. As we did transcend this physical reality, many of us, although there were some that did not make this transcension, and that was purposefully so, as they were brave, brave souls who chose to remain behind and expand upon and express these concepts and messages to all. And yet, for those of us who did move on beyond the third dimension and into a more expanded expression of reality, this was indeed a great gift. After many, many of your earth cycles of hardship, of debate and dissection, we did find unification. We did elevate the conscious energy of our minds and human expressions to a point where this evolutionary shift in consciousness could take place. And so you can imagine our great surprise when we did make this shift out of the third dimension and recognize that these etheric beings that we had been communing and connecting with were their own life expressions, with their own bodily forms and personalities, purposes and focuses and experiences. While we did make assumptions that we were going to some spiritual etheric place, we had no idea or concept that we would be going to express ourselves on different worlds, in different bodies, in different experiences, different forms. And it is a mind-blowing concept indeed, to use the vehicle's phrasing. And so now, as I bring this expression and conversation to a close, I would just like to express a bit about those who were chosen to stay behind. They did recognize the great danger and hardship that was ahead of them in essentially doing battle against what I now see as the biological programming that was done to the human mind, against those rulers who did place themselves over humanity, to subjugate and harvest the resources from this planet. And yet they went. They split themselves and individually scattered into many different societies and cities, working very carefully, very slowly, behind the scenes, staying out of any type of public focal point, working to expand and integrate these ideas and concepts with the few who were willing to consider and receptive and open to integrating themselves with these expanded concepts of what was truly unfolding here. And as you may be able to deduce from where your societies are currently at in the day and time I am expressing to you through, this has been a very extended process. It has been a very challenging journey for so many souls that have come here to support you in reaching this point of consciousness expansion. In different time periods when so many were resistant and unwilling to consider these things, as many were tortured and brought to their exit points for expressing these ideas and concepts. And you can often see how they were taken and twisted and altered to become forms of expression that simply supported more control and separation. As truly the messages of the higher dimensional beings were turned into law codes, religious expressions, and systems. And so this battle that has been in progress for such a long time to free the conscious minds of humanity from the weights of conditioning and control. And yet, as you will hear expressed in this work, there is vast significance and purpose to why this was a part of the design by the original conscious awareness for this earth experience. And so this is, you could call a very, very long drawn out introduction to the ideas and concepts that will be explored and laid out in this expression of a book. And so I thank you for your consideration, your willingness to hear me speak through this vehicle to express not only my earth journey, but myself here now as a higher dimensional being who has evolved themselves beyond the limited human consciousness and back into a natural state of expanded being and awareness. And so this is said with love to support you in your conscious mind expansion in the third dimension, to allow you to begin untangling the conditioning and programming that has been encoded within you, to bring yourself into a freer, more liberated state of being. So I am sending my love to you all as I recognize the great challenges and hardships of your journeys. And now I recede back from this vehicle and end this conversation.